The sun was dying over Deadwater Gulch, bleeding out across the desert sky in a blaze of orange and red. Heat still shimmered above the hard-pan ground, even as the air cooled with the coming night. From the east, a single rider emerged, a black silhouette against the burning horizon. Dust trailed behind him like smoke from a slow-burning fire. His coat, long and weather-worn, moved with the rhythm of his horse's stride, and the low creak of leather mixed with the distant whine of the wind. No one saw him arrive at first. Deadwater was the sort of town where the streets emptied when the sun dropped low, where curtains closed and voices hushed. But by the time the black horse reached the hitching post outside the Dust Devil Saloon, every eye in town had found him. Eli Cade swung down from the saddle with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who feared nothing, not the law, not the barrel of a stranger's gun. His boots were caked with red dirt from trails far beyond. The territory and a shadow of stubble framed his sharp jaw. There was a stillness to him, the kind that made men uneasy and women wary. A rifle was slung across his back, a revolver at his hip. Neither looked neglected. The outlaw's eyes swept the street, calm and cold, before landing on the saloon. Doors. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the bitter tang of spilled whiskey. Cards slapped against felt tables, and boots scuffed across warped floorboards. Conversation dulled to a murmur when Cade stepped in. Folks knew his face. They'd seen it on the worn posters nailed to the walls of every sheriff's office. In 6 states. The reward on his head was enough to change a man's life, but no one in that room had the stomach to try. Not yet. He didn't speak as he walked to the bar. The barkeep, a nervous man with a white apron and trembling hands, poured him a glass of whiskey without being asked. Cade's gloved hand closed around the glass, the amber liquid catching the light in a way that made it seem thicker, darker than it should have been. He didn't drink right away, just stood there listening. The piano player at the far end of the room faltered, then stopped entirely. No one knew why Eli Cade had come to Deadwater. Some said he was running from a deal gone wrong. Others whispered he'd come for something buried in the desert. Whatever the reason, it was the beginning of the last story anyone would ever tell about him. And by the time the moon rose over the rooftops, the first man in Deadwater Gulch would already be gone. Before we jump back in, make sure you subscribe. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special just for you. Another story, another secret, and maybe a whisper you weren't meant to hear. The morning after Eli Cade rode into Deadwater, the townsfolk woke to a sharper kind of silence. Sheriff Amos Coulter's office sat at the far end of Main Street, a squat building with faded green shutters and a cracked window. Just outside, nailed to a sun-bleached post, hung a wanted poster that had been flapping in the wind for weeks. The edges were curled, the ink faded from months in the desert sun, but the face was still unmistakable. Eli Cade. $5,000 reward, dead or alive. The portrait sketch captured his eyes well hard, watchful, with the kind of coldness a man didn't get without having seen too much and cared too little. It was said Cade had been wanted since the summer of '68, when he robbed a Union Gold train bound for Fort Sterling. Witnesses claimed he didn't wear a mask. He simply walked into the car, revolver loose in his hand, and told the guards to lay down their rifles. No one moved against him. The gold was gone before the train reached the next station, and by the time soldiers rode out after him, his tracks had vanished into the desert. There were other stories too, some less believable than others. A bank job in Santa Fe, where Cade allegedly shot a bullet clean through a hanging clock to mark the exact second of the robbery. A stagecoach heist near Laredo, where the driver swore Cade's horse ran faster than the wind itself. And then there were the darker tales, whispers that men who hunted him didn't just fail to catch him, they disappeared entirely. That morning in Deadwater, the talk was the same as it had always been wherever Cade's name drifted. In the barber shop, An old ranch hand spat tobacco into a rusted spittoon and swore he'd seen Cade duel 2 men at once and walk away without a scratch. Over at the general store, Mrs. Harlan told anyone who'd listen that Cade wasn't just a man, he was a curse. You didn't cross him unless you wanted your family to find your body face down in the dust. Sheriff Coulter had heard it all before. Sitting at his desk with the wanted poster laid flat before him, he traced the letters with his finger. He knew Cade was dangerous, but what unsettled him more was that no one seemed to know why Cade kept writing. Most outlaws had an endgame: gold, land, revenge. Cade seemed to be running from something else entirely, something that wasn't written down in any ledger. By midday, the story of Cade's arrival had reached every corner of town. The black horse, the silence in the saloon, the way he'd looked at people, as if he already knew how their lives would end. And behind it all was the reward. $5,000 was more than enough to tempt men into foolish decisions. That night, 3 of Deadwater's rougher types decided they'd try their luck. They didn't bother telling anyone, just slipped their pistols into their belts, whispered a prayer, and went looking for the outlaw. Only 2 came back. The Dust Devil Saloon was alive with noise that night. Boot heels on the floorboards, whiskey glasses clinking, the low murmur of men trying to outbluff each other over hands of cards. But the moment Eli Cade stepped through the swinging doors, the sound dimmed like someone had turned down the world. He didn't rush. Cade moved through the haze of smoke with the calm of a man who'd been in 100 saloons and never once worried about who might be waiting for him. His spurs clicked softly as he crossed to the far table, where 5 men sat hunched over a game of poker. One of them, a stocky ranch foreman named Duggan, narrowed his eyes. "You play?" he asked. Cade didn't answer. He simply pulled out the empty chair, the wood groaning under his weight, and laid down a silver dollar. The dealer, a wiry man with a thin scar running down his cheek, glanced at him once and began to shuffle. The cards whispered as they slid across the felt. The first few hands were quick. Cade played like a shadow, no smiles, no frowns, no tells. He didn't seem to care whether he won or lost, yet somehow the coins and bills kept stacking in front of him. Duggan's jaw tightened as his pile shrank. The others shifted in their seats, watching the stranger clean the table without breaking a sweat. Then came the last hand. The dealer slid Cade his final card. Cade looked at it then froze just for a heartbeat. His eyes drifted past the table, past the smoke, and fixed on the saloon's doorway. Every man at the table felt the weight of that pause. But no one turned to see what Cade was looking at. The air seemed colder. Somewhere outside, the wind picked up, howling low through the alleyways. Cade's gaze held steady, like he was seeing something the rest of them couldn't. Finally, he set the card down face down and pushed his winnings toward the center of the table. "I'm done here," he said, voice low and even. He stood, adjusted his coat, and walked straight past the dealer without collecting a single coin. Duggan let out a bitter laugh, but it died when he realized the saloon's doorway was empty. No one had been standing there. Hours later, one of the 3 men who'd gone hunting for Cade would swear they saw a pale figure watching from the street as the outlaw left the saloon. A figure that didn't move, didn't blink, and wasn't there when they looked again. Sheriff Amos Coulter found Eli Cade at the edge of town just before midnight. Cade's black horse stood tethered to a weathered fence post, its breath fogging in the cool night air. Cade himself was leaning against the rail, hat pulled low, eyes fixed on the dark line of the horizon. Coulter approached slow, the crunch of his boots loud in the quiet. His hand hovered near the grip of his Colt, but not quite touching it. Cade didn't turn when the sheriff stopped beside him. "You don't belong here, Eli," Coulter said. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd buried friends because of another man's choices. Cade finally looked at him. The lantern Light from the sheriff's office flickered behind them, casting their shadows long across the dirt. "I go where I need to go," Cade replied. "This town doesn't need trouble." Coulter's jaw worked as if he were chewing over the words, before spitting them out. "And trouble follows you like a shadow." For a moment, neither man moved. The wind tugged at Cade's coat. Somewhere far off, a coyote called. Coulter's fingers brushed the handle of his revolver. Cade's eyes flicked down, catching the motion. He gave the faintest hint of a smirk, the kind that said you're not fast enough. "You got any idea what folks are saying about you?" Coulter asked. "That you ain't just a man anymore. That you're something else." Cade stepped forward, closing the gap between them until they were nearly chest to chest. "Maybe they're right," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it, like a blade hidden under cloth. Coulter held his ground, but his heart was thudding in his chest. "Last warning, Cade, right out at first light. Don't look back." Cade tilted his head, studying the sheriff's eyes for a beat too long. Then he stepped back, swung up into the saddle, and rode off into the dark. The hoofbeats faded quick, swallowed by the desert night. By morning, the sheriff's horse wandered back into town alone, saddle empty, reins dragging in the dust. Sheriff Amos Coulter was never seen again. They called it midnight. Cade's horse was unlike anything the desert had ever seen. A towering black stallion with a coat that caught no light, as if it swallowed the moon. Its eyes glimmered faintly, not with the red of rage or the brown of any earthly creature, but with a pale, silver hue, like frost under starlight. The beast never seemed to tire, no matter how far it ran. Old-timers swore they could hear it before they saw it, a steady, bone-deep rhythm of hoofbeats that carried across the plains like distant thunder. Some men claimed they'd heard that sound hours before Cade ever rode into their town, a slow drumbeat warning that something was coming their way. It was said midnight didn't drink from streams or watering holes like other horses. More than one wrangler swore they'd seen it stand at the edge of a trough, staring into the water without lowering its head. And when Cade rode, the stallion moved with a speed and silence that didn't make sense, hooves barely seeming to touch the ground, kicking up no dust unless Cade wanted them to. There were darker stories, too. In the mining town of Calico Springs, a ranch hand claimed he'd tried to feed the horse a handful of oats, only for midnight to pin its ears, bare its teeth, and let out a sound that wasn't quite a neigh, more like a scream. A month later, that same ranch hand was found trampled outside the edge of town. Folks noticed the hoofprints didn't match any horse they knew. Some even whispered midnight wasn't alive at all, that it was the devil's own mount, loaned to Cade for reasons no man should try to understand. Those who believed that kept their distance when the black horse passed, eyes fixed on the ground, hands tight on their Bibles. But whatever midnight was, it had carried Cade further and faster than any lawman could follow. And on the morning after Sheriff Coulter vanished, the sound of its hoofbeats was heard heading out toward Rattlesnake Canyon, a place where sunlight rarely reached and men often rode in but didn't come back out. By sundown, 6 riders would follow Cade into that canyon. By sunrise, only their horses would return. Rattlesnake Canyon was the kind of place that felt wrong even before you saw it. The walls rose high and jagged, closing in tight like the earth itself wanted to swallow you whole. The air inside was still, the kind of stillness that made your own heartbeat sound too loud. Shadows clung to the rock faces, and somewhere deep within, the occasional hiss of a rattler echoed, carried by a wind that never seemed to touch your skin. Just after dawn, 6 men from Deadwater rode in. They were hard cases, gun hands and drifters who decided $5,000 was worth the risk. They'd seen Cade ride toward the canyon the day before, and they figured he'd bedded down inside. The plan was simple: fan out, close in, take him dead or alive. They never found his camp. The first sign something was wrong came when Owen Bartlett, the youngest of the six, spotted a strange mark on the canyon wall. It was blackened, the stone scorched as if lightning had struck it, only there wasn't a cloud in the sky. He reached out to touch it, and his palm came away warm, almost hot. Further in, they found more scorch marks, curling along the walls in patterns too deliberate to be natural. The horses grew restless, ears flicking back, eyes rolling white. By the time they reached the narrowest stretch of the canyon, the sun was just high enough to spill a thin beam of light across the ground, and that's when they saw the first shadow move. It wasn't Cade. Something darted between the rocks, tall and fast, too quick for them to make out. The horses bucked and snorted, one rearing so hard its rider hit the ground. A gunshot rang out, echoing until it was impossible to tell where it had come from. Another rider shouted, "Cade, show yourself." But no answer came. Then, from somewhere deeper in the canyon, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats began, slow at first. Then faster, louder, closer. The sound bounced off the walls, impossible to track, until it felt like it was coming from every direction at once. Men shouted, horses screamed, and gunfire cracked in the shadows. The canyon swallowed the echoes until all that was left was the sound of panicked hoofbeats pounding toward the mouth of the pass. By the time the sun touched the canyon rim again, 6 horses stumbled back into Deadwater. Their saddles were empty. Their riders were never found. And if you put your ear to the rock at the canyon's heart, locals swore you could still hear the hoofbeats going in circles, waiting. The desert stretched wide and empty that night, the moon hanging low like a silver coin just out of reach. Cade was seen riding east of Deadwater, midnight's hoofbeats muffled against the sand. There was no trail, no destination, just the endless dark horizon. A lone drifter named Jeb Harlan had made camp by a cluster of mesquite trees. He was rolling a cigarette when he saw movement out in the open flats. At first he thought it was heat shimmer, but the air was cool, the night wind still. Then, out of the pale light, a woman appeared. She wore a long white dress that dragged against the sand, the fabric untouched by dust. Her hair was black, falling in loose waves over her shoulders, and her skin seemed almost too pale under the moonlight. She didn't walk so much as glide, her steps leaving no mark in the ground. Behind her, Cade reigned in midnight. The outlaw sat motionless in the saddle, watching her approach. Jeb couldn't hear their words, if there were any, but he saw Cade lean forward slightly, his head tilting in a way that wasn't like him. It was as if he were listening to something only he could hear. The woman stopped a few paces from the horse. For a long moment, they simply stood there in the moonlit silence. Then, without warning, she reached up, her hand brushing Midnight's muzzle. Cade stiffened. Jeb swore the temperature dropped so sharply that his breath smoked in the air. The woman turned her head slowly, and Jeb caught sight of her face for the first time. Her eyes were black, not dark brown, not shadowed, but black, swallowing the whites entirely. They locked onto Jeb's from across the desert, and in that instant, he felt as though she knew every lie he'd ever told. When he blinked, she was gone. Cade was gone too. The empty flats stretched unbroken in every direction, as if neither horse nor rider had ever been there. Jeb left Deadwater the next morning, walking away from his camp without packing a thing. He never returned, but in every saloon he passed through after, he told the same story, that Cade wasn't riding alone anymore. Bitter Hollow was little more than a speck on most maps, a mining town 3 days west of Deadwater, settled in a narrow valley where the hills hid veins of silver. It had a single main street lined with clapboard buildings, a small church with a leaning steeple, and a saloon that never locked its doors. Folks there were used to strangers passing through. They weren't used to strangers staying. On a Wednesday afternoon, Eli Cade was seen riding into Bitter Hollow. Witnesses, what few there were, said he didn't slow down. He passed the general store, the blacksmiths, even the saloon without a word. Some swore they saw the woman in white walking a few paces behind midnight, though no tracks followed her in the dust. Cade headed toward the far end of town, where the road narrowed between two hills. No one saw him ride back out. 3 days later, a trader named Lyle Bennett rolled in from the north with a wagon full of dry goods. He'd expected to rest in Bitter Hollow before the next leg of his journey. Instead, he found nothing. The valley was there. The hills were there. But where the town had been, there was only open dirt, scattered rocks, and a few patches of stubborn sagebrush. No buildings. No debris, no footprints. Not even the rusted iron bell that had once hung in the church tower. It was as if Bitter Hollow had never been built at all. Lael camped there for one uneasy night, too far from the next settlement to make it before dark. Around midnight, he woke to the faint sound of piano music drifting through the valley, slow, haunting, almost mournful. He followed the sound for a few steps before it faded, replaced by the echo of hoof beats. In the morning, his wagon wheels left deep ruts in the dirt. But behind him, the ground was smooth again, as if something had swept it clean. When Lyle finally reached Deadwater and told his story, the barkeep muttered a single thing before pouring him a drink. Bitter Hollow ain't the first place Cade's ridden through that's gone missing. It was nearly 10 years after Bitter Hollow vanished when a prospector named Jonah Pike stumbled into a campfire circle deep in the Nevada desert. His beard was thick and unkempt, his clothes torn, and his eyes held the wide, fevered look of a man who'd been walking too long under the sun. The men around the fire gave him water, a strip of jerky, and a place to sit. Jonah drank greedily, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. For a long while, he stared into the flames without speaking. Finally, one of the cowhands asked where he'd come from. Jonah's voice was hoarse, but the words were steady. "I had company out there," he said. "Rode in with me last night. Name of Eli Cade." The fire went quiet. Everyone had heard the name. Jonah told them he'd been following a dry riverbed when he spotted a lone rider ahead. Cade looked exactly like the old wanted posters, same black duster, same pale-eyed stallion. He hadn't aged a day since Jonah had last seen his face. Tacked up in a sheriff's office 20 years ago. Cade had asked Jonah where he was headed, and when Jonah said he didn't rightly know, Cade laughed. Not cruelly, but like he understood. They shared a bottle of whiskey under the stars, the kind of silence between them that didn't need filling. Cade had spoken little, only asking questions about the land, where the old trails led, whether certain towns still stood. Jonah said he woke in the middle of the night to find the whiskey bottle standing upright beside him, full again, frost beating on the glass. Cade was gone. One of the cowhands leaned forward. "You sure it wasn't a dream?" Jonah looked him dead in the eye. "Dreams don't leave tracks." The men followed him out the next morning to where he'd camped. There were no tracks. Not from Cade, not from midnight. Only Jonah's own prints. A lonely trail leading in from the desert. By the time Jonah Pike left that camp, the men weren't sure if they'd fed a prospector or a messenger. It was a rancher's boy who found it first. 11 years old, chasing after a stray calf through a stretch of mesquite, no one much bothered. Whiff. The land out there was dry and stubborn, littered with rocks and thornbush, the kind of place rattlesnakes had to fight for shade. The boy tripped over something half buried in the dust. At first he thought it was just another piece of deadwood, but when he brushed away the dirt, he saw the shape of a weathered wooden cross. It was crude, made from 2 uneven planks lashed together with a strip of frayed leather. There was no name, no date. Beside the cross lay a revolver. The metal was rusted, the grip worn smooth by years of use. On the handle, scratched deep into the wood, were 2 letters, EC. The boy took the revolver to his father, who rode into Deadwater to show the sheriff. The lawman squinted at the initials, then at the boy. Where exactly did you find this?" By afternoon, half the town had gathered out at the site. The sheriff ordered the ground dug up, certain they'd find the outlaw's bones beneath. The work was slow under the beating sun, shovels biting into hard earth. Finally, with a groan, the last layer of dirt gave way. The hole was empty. Number: coffin, no bones. Just a hollow space in the earth, cool to the touch despite the heat. Some folks muttered that maybe the body had been moved. Others whispered that it had never been there at all, that the grave was just a marker for something else entirely. The sheriff took the revolver back to his office and locked it in the evidence cabinet. That night, he was woken by the sound of hoof beats outside his window. When he looked out, the street was empty. In the morning, the cabinet door was hanging open. The revolver was gone. Every year, on the same night Sheriff Coulter vanished, the desert went quiet. It was the kind of stillness that made coyotes hush their calls, and made the wind itself seem to hold its breath. Folks in Deadwater knew what was coming. They didn't talk about it, not out loud, but they felt it. It always began the same way, with the sound of hoofbeats. Slow at first, far off, like a rider coming in from a great distance. The sound would build, carrying through the sand and sagebrush, echoing off the hills in a way no natural sound should. Those who heard it swore they could tell the horse wasn't just running, it was pacing, circling. Some claimed they saw him, a lone rider on a black stallion, keeping just far enough from the campfire light to stay in shadow. Cade's hat brim would tilt down, hiding his eyes, but the silver gleam from midnight's gaze was unmistakable. He never spoke, never drew his gun. Just rode the perimeter, silent except for the drum of hooves against hard earth. Once, a group of cowhands decided to call his bluff. They lit a dozen lanterns and waited in the open, rifles ready. The hoofbeats came like always, so did the shadow. But the moment one of the men stepped forward, every lantern went out at once. When the light returned, the men were alone. Their rifles were gone. And in the dirt at their feet was a single playing card. The ace of spades, its edges curling in the night wind. Over the years, travelers learned not to camp near Deadwater in the month of Coulter's disappearance. But every now and then, someone would get caught out late, unknowing. And the next morning, their camp would be found abandoned, bedrolls still, warm, fire still smoldering. But no sign of the rider or the men who'd seen him. Those who believed said Cade wasn't haunting the desert, he was hunting it. They say every gunman's life ends in one of two ways, a rope or a bullet. For Eli Cade, folks figured it'd be the latter. And according to the oldest stories, that bullet was fired under a blood-red moon. It happened out on the dry flats, between Deadwater and the Colorado border. The moon was swollen, casting a crimson glow across the sand, turning every shadow into something darker and stranger. That's when he appeared, the bounty hunter known only as the Pale Rider. Nobody knew his real name. He wore a long, ash-colored coat and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, his face pale as bone under the brim. Word was he'd tracked Cade for years, never more than a day behind. Some said the man had a personal grudge. Others claimed he'd been hired by someone with pockets deep enough to keep him riding forever. The two met without a word. Cade sat astride Midnight, the stallions, breath steaming in the cool air. The Pale Rider dismounted, boots crunching softly in the silence. He rested one hand on the grip of his revolver. Cade mirrored the motion. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind stilled, then both men drew. The crack of gunfire rolled across the flats like thunder. Two flashes lit the night. Then darkness again. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. Midnight reared, screaming into the blood moon. Cade's hat blew from his head, but he stayed in the saddle for a moment. Then he leaned forward, almost as if he were whispering into the horse's ear, and Midnight bolted into the night. When the dust cleared, the Pale Rider was gone. No body, no blood. Just two sets of hoof prints leading away from the site. One from midnight, one from a pale horse that no one ever saw again. Some claimed Cade took a bullet that night and didn't live to see sunrise. Others swore the duel never ended. That both men kept riding, locked in a chase that would never stop. And under certain red moons, out on the flats, riders still swear they hear two sets of hoofbeats thundering past in the dark. Decades passed. Towns rose and fell. Railroads carved through the land where Cade once rode, and the West began to wear the face of a new century, but the stories never stopped. In saloons from Texas to Nevada, men spoke of a stranger who would drift in just after sundown. He wore a long black duster and a weathered hat pulled low over his face. Sometimes he'd stand at the bar and order a whiskey. Sometimes he'd sit at a corner table, silent, watching the door. But it was always the same detail that people remembered. His eyes, hollow, not empty in the way of a tired man, but hollow like there was nothing behind them. Like staring into a well that had no bottom. He never stayed long. He'd leave the drink untouched or push it away after a single sip. And before he left, he would always ask the same question. What year is it? No one ever saw him walk out. They'd glance away, just for a moment, and when they looked back, the chair was empty. One barkeep in a small Arizona town swore he'd seen the man's reflection in the bar mirror, even after the chair was vacant. Another claimed that the silver coin he was paid for the drink turned to dust in his pocket before the night was over. Sometimes, the stranger was spotted miles away that same night, riding a black horse across open ground at a speed no living animal could match. And those who knew the name said it softly, as if speaking too loud might draw the rider closer. Eli Cade hadn't aged. Eli Cade hadn't died. Eli Cade was still out there, wearing the same face from the wanted posters, eyes hollow as the desert sky at midnight. And if he was still riding, it meant he was still hunting. In the end, it was the absence that kept Eli Cade alive in the minds of men. Every outlaw eventually meets the noose, the bullet, or the grave. Cade had met none of them. Lawmen from 6 different territories had hunted him in life. Historians and bounty hunters chased him in death, if that's what it was. None ever found a body, none found a grave. And without a grave, there was no end to the story, only more shadows for it to grow in. Some said he was buried in a canyon so deep the sun never touched the bottom, his bones guarded by something far older than the West. Others swore he'd made a deal with the devil himself, trading his soul for a horse that could outrun death. A few whispered that he was never a man at all, just a curse given shape, riding from one unlucky soul to the next. Every sheriff who took up the case ended the same way. More questions than answers, more nights spent staring at maps and reports until the ink blurred. One marshal from New Mexico spent 20 years collecting every story, every sighting, every scrap of rumor. He died with the file still open on his desk, a set of fresh hoofprints in the dust outside his window. But the strangest thing was how the stories followed the same rhythm, as if Cade's appearances were timed. A sighting in Nevada would be followed weeks later by another in Colorado, then months later in Arizona, always circling back toward Deadwater, as though something tied him to the place. And through it all, the truth remained out of reach. Because without a body, there could be no proof. And without proof, the legend would never die. The highway cut through the Nevada desert like a strip of faded ribbon, stretching so far into the distance, it seemed to vanish into heat and sky. It was past midnight when trucker Hank Madsen found himself alone on that road, the radio crackling with static and the headlights carving twin tunnels through the dark. The moon was bright, the kind that made the desert glow silver. That's when he saw movement in his side mirror, a shadow keeping pace with his rig. At first he thought it was another vehicle, maybe a biker riding without lights. But when he looked closer, he saw it, a black horse. It was running alongside his 18-wheeler, hooves pounding the asphalt, mane streaming like smoke. On its back sat a man in a long coat, hat pulled low. The stallion's eyes caught the moonlight and flashed silver, and Hank's grip on the wheel tightened. He could see the rider's face now, sharp, unchanging, eyes dark as an unlit well. The man turned his head slowly, meeting Hank's gaze through the glass. And even with the roar of the engine and the rush of wind, Hank swore he could hear the steady beat of those hooves, louder and louder until it was all he could hear. Then the rider smiled. Hank blinked, just once, and the road beside him was empty, no horse, no rider. Nothing but the endless stretch of desert. When he pulled into a truck stop an hour later, his hands were still shaking. He told no one that night. But the next day, he called an old friend in Arizona, a man who'd spent years chasing ghost stories. Hank didn't give him details, didn't need to. He just said, "I think I saw him." The friend's voice was quiet on the other end. "You mean Eli Cade? No one ever found his body. No one ever proved he died. And some say that if you drive long enough under a desert moon, you might still hear the echo of hooves keeping pace in the dark, waiting for you to look there." "Way,